The sun had barely begun its slow descent behind the jagged outline of the distant mesas, casting long shadows over the rugged expanse of the ranch. Dust hung in the warm air, stirred by the occasional gust that swept across the open plain. Here, the land seemed almost endless, a mixture of rocky outcroppings, sparse scrub, and tall, dry grasses that whispered with the wind. For those unfamiliar with it, the ranch appeared harsh, even unwelcoming, but to the rancher, it was home. It was a place of both freedom and isolation, where every day required effort, skill, and an intimate knowledge of the land's rhythms. Thier, rancher himself, was a man shaped by solitude and hard work. His face, weathered by years under the relentless sun, bore the deep lines of experience and endurance. His hands were calloused, marked with the faint scars of past labor, the kind only a life spent riding, fixing fences, and working the land could leave. There was a quiet strength in his movements, a precision honed over years of navigating the unpredictable terrain of the high plains. He had learned to read the land as one might read a familiar book. The subtle shift in the wind, the distant cry of a hawk, or the faint rustle of animals moving unseen in the brush. Each detail mattered. Each sound carried meaning for survival and the practical running of the ranch. Yet despite his competence, there was a loneliness that lingered beneath the surface. The rancher had few visitors and even fewer companions. Neighbors were miles away, and the trails that wound through the surrounding canyons and mesas often went untraveled. The land offered freedom, yes, but also demanded resilience, and the rancher had long ago learned to rely primarily on himself. This life, chosen or forced by circumstance, had instilled in him a deep appreciation for the quiet moments. Watching the sky blaze with color at sunrise, listening to the wind move through the canyons, or feeling the earth firm beneath his boots as he walked his territory. This particular evening, however, carried with it a subtle urgency. The chill of approaching night made itself known as the shadows lengthened and the air grew crisp. Inside his modest cabin, a small wood stove sat cold, its stack of neatly cut firewood already dangerously low. The rancher paused at the doorway, surveying the empty pile of logs that had once been sufficient to see him through long, cold nights. A practical man by nature, he recognized the need to replenish it before darkness fell. Firewood was more than a source of warmth. It was safety, comfort, and survival in equal measure. Even as he prepared for the task, the rancher's eyes wandered across the expanse of his land. The mesas rose like silent guardians, their red and ochre faces glowing in the last light of day. The scrub brush rustled with the movement of small animals, and in the distance, the sound of a creek trickled faintly, a reminder that life, however sparse, persisted in these remote reaches. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and earth, a fragrance that was at once familiar and grounding. For a moment he allowed himself a quiet reflection on the solitude he had come to accept, the freedom it brought, the responsibilities it demanded, and the inevitable loneliness that came with it. As the rancher prepared to venture out, he felt the familiar weight of his leather satchel and the sturdiness of his boots against the uneven ground. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had faced many trials alone, aware of every rock and rut that could trip an unwary step. Though the task seemed simple, to gather firewood, there was a subtle anticipation in his movements, a reminder that the land could be unpredictable and that even the simplest ventures required vigilance. This opening scene sets the tone for the story, a harsh but beautiful landscape, a solitary man shaped by his environment, and a quiet tension that hints at the unexpected events to come. The introduction not only establishes the rancher's character and the environment, but also frames the narrative around themes of isolation, survival, and the quiet, ever-present dialogue between a man and the land he inhabits. It is a world, both grounded in reality and open to the possibility of unforeseen encounters that may challenge the rancher's solitary existence. As the rancher stepped out from the shelter of his cabin, the crisp evening air immediately met him, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and sagebrush. The last rays of sunlight shimmered across the mesas, painting them in deep reds and oranges, and shadows stretched long across the uneven terrain. The quiet that had settled over the ranch all day now seemed almost absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of a lizard or the faint scurry of a rabbit through the brush. For the rancher, this silence was both familiar and slightly unsettling, the kind of stillness that made one acutely aware of every sound, every movement, and every possibility in the surrounding wilderness. His gaze fell upon the small stack of firewood beside the cabin, or more accurately, what remained of it. Only a few splintered logs were left, haphazardly piled in the corner, some partially charred from previous nights. The realization struck him with mild frustration. He would not make it through the night with what little remained. Winter had been mild so far, but the temperature was dropping faster than he expected, and darkness always brought a sharper chill. Without a fire, he would face a long, uncomfortable, and potentially dangerous night. He knew the necessity of action. It was not merely about comfort, but survival. The rancher checked the contents of his satchel, a small hatchet, some rope, and a leather pouch containing a few essentials for a brief excursion. Everything was in place, prepared through years of practice for such outings. Yet, even with these preparations, there was a familiar weight in his chest. It was the weight of isolation, a reminder that when venturing into the wild, he could rely only on his skills, instincts, and judgment. Any misstep could result in an injury or a miscalculation, with consequences that might linger until help arrived, if help ever arrived at all. He set off toward the north ridge, where the scrub was denser and larger fallen trees often lay in wait, broken limbs from past storms creating natural caches of firewood. The path was familiar. He had traversed it countless times, often without thought, yet the rancher knew that familiarity bred both confidence and complacency. Every crack of a twig beneath his boots, every whisper of wind through the branches, served as a reminder that the wilderness was alive, ever-changing, and unpredictable. As he moved deeper into the terrain, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky transformed into a vast canvas of deep purples and indigo. Shadows darkened the crevices between rocks, making navigation slightly more difficult, though his eyes had long since adapted to the fading light. The temperature dropped steadily, and the rancher felt a shiver run through him, not from fear, but from awareness of the elements. He adjusted the collar of his coat, tightening it against the creeping chill, and mentally prepared for the work ahead. Gathering firewood in this environment was laborious. It required strength, careful selection of suitable logs, and constant attention to footing on uneven ground. It was then, as he scanned the ridge for a promising pile of deadfall, that he noticed something out of place. Beyond the familiar clusters of scrub and rock, there was a structure partially obscured by a grove of twisted trees, an old shack, worn and weathered, its roof sagging and walls scarred by time and weather. The rancher had traversed this land many times over the years, and he had never seen this particular building. At first, he considered the possibility of misjudgment, a trick of shadows in the dimming light, but as he squinted, the outlines became unmistakable. It was a human-made structure, abandoned yet oddly preserved in a way that piqued both his curiosity and his caution. A mixture of apprehension and intrigue pulled him closer. He paused at the edge of the grove, listening. No sounds came from the shack, except the occasional creak of timber shifting in the wind. The rancher's instincts told him to approach carefully. There was always risk in the unknown. Yet there was also the undeniable pull of curiosity, a force that had led him to many discoveries throughout his life. This moment, small in the grand scale of his experiences, carried the potential to change the course of his evening. And, as he would soon learn, much more than that. The inciting incident, in essence, is not merely the need for firewood, but the discovery of something unexpected. What begins as a simple, practical errand soon becomes the catalyst for an encounter that will challenge his perceptions, introduce new tensions, and push him into a situation that blends danger, mystery, and human connection. This moment transforms the mundane task of gathering wood into the threshold of a story where the ordinary and extraordinary collide. The rancher tightened the straps of his satchel and stepped cautiously toward the grove where the old shack had appeared. The uneven ground beneath his boots forced him to move deliberately, balancing on loose rocks and weaving through patches of thorny scrub. Each step carried a faint crunch as gravel shifted and dry twigs snapped underfoot, sending small flocks of birds fluttering skyward. The air was now fully chilled, and he could see his breath forming short, visible clouds that vanished almost, immediately into the dusk. Despite the cold, his mind was alert, every sense heightened by a combination of curiosity and caution. As he moved deeper into the grove, the landscape shifted subtly. The flat expanse of the prairie gave way to a gentle incline, and the scattered trees created a lattice of shadows across the ground. The rancher had traveled these parts countless times before, but tonight, under the deepening darkness, the familiar seemed strange and foreign. Branches overhead rustled as if whispering secrets, and the wind carried a sharper, almost metallic scent that hinted at moisture and decay. He paused occasionally, listening, noting the absence of the usual wildlife sounds. The silence was unusual, almost expectant, as though the land itself was waiting to reveal something. The path toward the shack became more challenging. Fallen logs and gnarled roots forced him to step carefully, testing each foothold before placing his weight. The rancher's muscles tensed with the effort, but he moved steadily, guided by the outline of the shack that now stood more clearly against the dimming sky. It was low-slung, with warped wooden boards and a roof that sagged under years of neglect. The building seemed fragile, yet it exuded a stubborn persistence, holding itself upright despite the evident decay. Every plank told a story of storms weathered and seasons endured. As he drew closer, he noticed signs of recent activity. Footprints in the dusty soil, faint impressions of boots that didn't belong to him. The rancher's heart quickened, though he maintained his composed exterior. For all his years in the wilderness, encounters with strangers had been rare and often fraught with danger. Yet, the tracks were small, delicate, and seemed intentional rather than random, suggesting the presence of someone, or several people, who had been careful not to leave a trace. The realization both intrigued and alarmed him. This was no ordinary abandoned shack. He paused behind a thick clump of brush, peering through the shadows. The shack's single window offered a glimpse inside, and what he saw made him freeze for a moment. Figures moved within, 3 of them unmistakably human, crouched and busy with some activity he could not yet discern. Their posture was wary, their movements precise, as though they had been taught to be cautious in every gesture. Though their faces were partly obscured by shadow and distance, there was something striking about them, a quiet strength, a resilience born of necessity. The rancher took a steadying breath. His instinct told him to retreat and leave these strangers undisturbed. Yet curiosity gnawed at him, compelling him to continue forward. There was a tension within him, a conflict between the safe routine of his life and the unknown that now lay directly before him. Every fiber of his being was alert, every sense attuned to the subtleties of sound, smell, and movement in the grove. He adjusted his grip on the hatchet at his side, more out of habit than expectation of threat, and took another careful step forward. The path narrowed, hemmed in by thorny bushes and leaning trees. He brushed aside branches, feeling the snap of twigs, and the occasional scratch against his hands and face. The night was falling rapidly, the final vestiges of sunlight disappearing beyond the horizon, leaving only a soft glow of twilight that barely illuminated the forest floor. Shadows deepened, shapes became ambiguous, and the rancher's imagination began to fill in gaps. Yet he pressed on, guided by both necessity and a rising sense of anticipation. As he neared the shack, he reflected briefly on the simplicity of his original task. Gathering firewood had seemed straightforward, a routine chore, yet now it had transformed into something far more complex. The journey itself had become an internal test of courage and judgment. Every cautious step brought him closer to discovery, but also closer to unknown risk. The wilderness, in its indifferent majesty, had a way of exposing the limits of human experience, and the rancher was acutely aware that the events of this night might linger far beyond a single excursion. Finally, the rancher reached a spot where the shack was almost fully visible. The faint outlines of the three figures inside were clearer now. Their activity was still mysterious, their presence unexpected, and the air between him and the building seemed charged with tension. He crouched slightly, careful not to announce himself, considering his next move. The journey had carried him, here, deeper than he had ever ventured for firewood, into a threshold where ordinary life met the extraordinary. It was the precipice of discovery, the point at which curiosity and caution collided, and the rancher sensed that the outcome of this encounter would alter his evening, and perhaps much more than that. The rancher's heart thudded in his chest as he emerged from the final cluster of trees, finally standing at the edge of a small clearing. There it was, the old shack, battered by time and weather, yet somehow still standing with an air of stubborn defiance. Its wooden walls were cracked and warped, and the roof sagged unevenly, as if burdened by decades of neglect. Sunlight no longer reached the boards directly. The shadows of the surrounding trees had claimed most of its surfaces, giving it a ghostly, almost secretive presence. It was the kind of structure that seemed to breathe with the history of those who had inhabited it, a silent witness to countless, untold stories. The rancher approached cautiously, his boots stirring the dry earth and crunching over scattered stones. Every instinct told him to proceed slowly, to read the environment as carefully as he would read a weathered map. He paused at intervals, scanning the perimeter of the shack, noting the absence of doors ajar or obvious signs of forced entry. Yet the subtle details, footprints in the dirt, a faint trail of crushed grass leading to the window, a small pile of debris near the side of the building, all indicated recent human presence. Whoever had been here was deliberate, careful, and likely wary of strangers. He crouched slightly as he moved closer, peering through a narrow gap in the planks of the wall. Inside, the dim interior revealed movement. Three figures, crouched, or seated on the dusty wooden floor, were engaged in some task, tending a small fire or arranging items in a careful, methodical manner. The rancher could not yet discern their faces clearly, but he noted the grace and alertness of their movements. There was a quiet vigilance about them, a subtle tension that suggested they were accustomed to living under constant awareness of danger. His curiosity mingled with caution. He had stumbled upon this place unexpectedly, and though he was driven by a desire to understand who these people were and why they were here, he was also acutely aware of the potential risks. The wilderness could be unforgiving, and the unexpected presence of strangers carried unknown consequences. Yet there was something compelling in the sight. The delicate balance between the fragility of the shack and the apparent strength of its inhabitants intrigued him. The rancher decided to approach more openly, but still carefully. He stepped onto a loose patch of gravel that crunched underfoot, and immediately one of the figures froze, her head turning sharply toward the sound. For a moment, the clearing was charged with tension. The rancher raised his hand slightly, a gesture of non-threatening intent, and spoke in a calm, measured tone. I don't mean any harm. I'm just passing through. His voice, though quiet, carried across the small distance, and the three figures exchanged wary glances. The silence stretched as the rancher observed them more closely. They were women, their hair dark and braided, their clothing simple yet functional, designed for mobility and practicality. Their eyes, dark and wary, seemed to assess him instantly, measuring his intent and gauging the danger. The rancher, trained by years of solitude and outdoor experience, recognized the signs of caution. The subtle shifts in posture, the guarded positioning of hands, the alertness in every movement. These were not idle strangers. They were people who had learned to survive under conditions that demanded constant vigilance. The moment felt suspended in time, a fragile balance between the known and unknown. The rancher considered his next steps carefully. Any sudden movement could provoke fear or even hostility. He studied the surrounding ground, noticing small details that suggested they had lived here for some time. A worn spot on the floor, remnants of what might have been food storage, and simple tools arranged neatly in a corner. This was not a place abandoned entirely. It was a refuge, a temporary home carefully maintained despite its outward decay. Finally, the rancher spoke again, his tone steady and respectful. "I'm looking for firewood. I didn't expect to find anyone here." His words, simple and factual, seemed to carry sincerity. One of the women tilted her head slightly, a subtle gesture indicating curiosity mingled with caution. The rancher sensed that this encounter, delicate and precarious, was the beginning of a story far larger than a simple errand for firewood. Today on the show, we're diving into the world of economic indicators. These are the numbers that tell us how the economy is doing, things like GDP, unemployment rates, and consumer confidence. But what do these indicators really mean? How are they calculated? And how should we interpret them? We'll break it all down for you with the help of some experts to make sense of the numbers that shape our world. The rancher stopped just beyond the last cluster of trees, his eyes fixed on the dilapidated shack. He felt a tight knot of uncertainty settle in his chest. He had seen the figures inside, three women whose movements were deliberate and watchful, and yet he did not know whether they were friend or foe. For a moment, the wilderness seemed to close in around him. The wind rustled through the scrub, shadows shifted across the clearing, and the faint creak of the shack's weathered boards punctuated the tense silence. It was a moment suspended between action and inaction, and the rancher was acutely aware of the delicate balance he now faced. He crouched slightly, leaning against the rough bark of a nearby tree, and studied the women more closely. Each of them was alert, their posture rigid with caution, their eyes flicking toward any sound that might indicate movement. The rancher noted the care with which they maintained their space, the subtle organization of what little belongings they had, and the quiet efficiency in their gestures. These women were survivors, cautious, intelligent, and fully aware of the dangers that could befall anyone traveling alone in the wilderness. Their vigilance was instinctual, born of necessity, and it reminded him that he was stepping into a world governed by rules different from his own. His own instincts, honed by years of solitude, urged him to proceed with care. Every step he had taken to reach this point had brought him closer to discovery, yet now hesitation gripped him. One false move, one misinterpreted action, could provoke fear or aggression. The rancher weighed his options carefully. He could retreat, leaving the shack and its inhabitants undisturbed, preserving his safety, but abandoning the possibility of understanding or connection. Or he could approach, slowly and respectfully, signaling his lack of threat while attempting to communicate. The cold evening air seemed to press in around him, and he shivered, more from tension than from temperature. He adjusted his stance, shifting his weight and taking a slow, measured breath. His eyes scanned the perimeter of the shack once more, noting potential escape routes, the uneven ground, and the play of shadows across the floor. He considered. The sound of the wind, the distant calls of birds settling for the night, and the subtle rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Everything was a clue, everything a potential risk. Time seemed to stretch, each second laden with the weight of uncertainty. The rancher reflected briefly on the simplicity of his original task, gathering firewood. The ordinary errand had transformed into a journey of unknown consequences, and now he faced a threshold he had not anticipated. The shack was no longer merely a building, it was a space occupied by life, intelligence, and caution. The women inside were not passive observers. They were active participants in their own survival, and any interaction would require his full attention and respect. He shifted his focus inward, drawing on his experience and judgment. Years of solitude had taught him patience, observation, and the value of measured action. He reminded himself that the wilderness demanded respect, and human encounters within it demanded even more. Hesitation was not weakness. It was strategy. By pausing, by assessing, he increased his chances of a safe and constructive interaction. The women's initial wariness could not be rushed, and any misstep could close off the possibility of dialogue entirely. Finally, the rancher made a slow, deliberate decision. He would approach, but cautiously, allowing the women to observe his movements and interpret his intent. Every gesture would be controlled, every word carefully chosen. He stepped forward a few paces, stopping where the shadows partially obscured him, and lowered his hat slightly, a subtle signal of respect. He spoke softly, ensuring that his voice was calm and measured. "I mean no harm," he said, the words carrying both sincerity and a note of caution. "I'm just here for firewood." The women responded with subtle movements, a tilt of the head, a brief exchange of glances, but no immediate aggression. The rancher felt the tension ease slightly, replaced by a cautious curiosity. He understood that trust would not come instantly. It would be earned, slowly and carefully. His initial hesitation, though uncomfortable, had allowed him to observe, assess, and prepare for the delicate interaction ahead. It was a small but crucial step, bridging the gap between solitude and connection, fear and understanding. In that moment, standing on the edge of the clearing, the rancher realized that he was not merely gathering firewood anymore. He was stepping into a story that would challenge his assumptions, test his patience, and ultimately reshape his understanding of the world beyond his ranch. The initial hesitation, the careful assessment of danger, and the decision to approach with respect were the first acts of a journey that promised to be as unpredictable as the wilderness itself. The rancher took a cautious step forward, each movement deliberate, measured, designed to show he meant no harm. The shadows of the shack enveloped him, giving him some cover, yet the figures inside were alert, their eyes following his approach like hawks watching prey, or perhaps potential allies. He could feel the tension in the air, a taut thread connecting him to the women within. For a moment, everything seemed suspended. The rustling wind, the distant calls of night birds, the creak of the shack's timbers, all background to this fragile confrontation between strangers. He raised one hand, slowly, palm outward, a gesture of peace he had used countless times in his solitary travels when encountering wary animals or suspicious neighbors. "I don't want to startle you," he said, his voice calm but carrying across the small clearing. "I'm only looking for firewood. I didn't expect anyone to be here." The words were simple, factual, devoid of arrogance or unnecessary explanation. The rancher had learned that sincerity was often understood more clearly than long-winded reasoning. The women paused. One of them, seemingly the eldest, shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing as she assessed him. She moved cautiously toward the window, her posture alert, her hands loosely positioned in a defensive stance. The other two remained slightly behind, their bodies tensed, ready to react if necessary. The rancher noticed the subtle communication. Among them, a glance here, a slight nod there, silent signals that conveyed caution and hierarchy without a word. He took another small step forward, keeping his hands visible. "I'll stay outside," he added, emphasizing his respect for their space. "I don't want to intrude." His words seemed to carry weight, and the eldest woman's posture relaxed slightly, though her gaze remained watchful. The rancher felt a surge of cautious hope. The first barrier of fear was thinning, the initial tension beginning to give way to curiosity. From within the shack, the women moved with quiet precision. They gestured subtly, one bringing a hand to her chest, another to the ground, a form of silent communication that the rancher could only interpret as measured negotiation, an invitation to remain but with rules unspoken, a cautious allowance of presence. The rancher recognized this as a critical moment. His next moves would determine whether the encounter remained tense or began to transition into trust. He nodded slowly, acknowledging their signals. He bent slightly at the waist, a nonverbal gesture of respect, and shifted his weight to a stance that made him appear smaller, less threatening. The eldest woman's eyes softened fractionally, and she motioned toward a small space near the shack, where he could remain visible but not too close. He moved into position carefully, mindful of every sound his boots made against the dry earth. The rancher observed them closely, noting the way they handled simple objects, their deliberate movements, and the quiet attention to detail that suggested survival skills honed over time. Their faces, partially shadowed, revealed expressions of curiosity mixed with caution, a delicate balance between welcoming and guarding. He realized these women were not passive. They were aware, intelligent, and fully capable of assessing the situation in a matter of moments. The encounter was not about dominance or control, but understanding, a negotiation of trust conducted in silence and gestures as much as in words. Finally, the eldest woman spoke, her voice low and measured. "Who are you?" she asked, eyes never leaving his. The rancher appreciated the simplicity and directness of the question. It was not a test of knowledge or skill, but an invitation to reveal intent. "I'm just a rancher from nearby," he replied. "I came out to gather firewood. I didn't mean to intrude. I didn't expect anyone here." His tone conveyed honesty, and he maintained eye contact without seeming confrontational. The rancher remained in the small clearing, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The women inside the shack shifted occasionally, their eyes never leaving him. There was a palpable tension in the air, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and a subtle, unspoken test of boundaries. Each side measured the other, searching for signals that could indicate safety or threat. The rancher understood instinctively that this interaction would not be resolved in a single gesture or word. Trust, if it came at all, would be slow and fragile. One of the women, younger than the others, stepped slightly forward and rested her hand lightly on the frame of the window. Her eyes, dark and wary, met his, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if she were weighing his intent with a precision born of necessity. The rancher raised his hands slightly, palms outward, signaling again that he meant no harm. "I won't come closer unless you want me to," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I'm just looking for wood." The simplicity of his statement seemed to resonate with them, yet their expressions remained guarded. The eldest woman's voice, low and deliberate, broke the tense silence. "Why are you here alone?" she asked, a question that was more than curiosity. It was an assessment of character, a probe into his reliability, his experience, his intentions. The rancher considered his answer carefully. "I live on a ranch nearby," he replied. "I take care of the land, the animals, and myself. I've spent many nights alone in the wild. I know how to stay safe." His words carried the weight of truth, shaped by years of solitude and survival in this rugged terrain. The second woman, standing slightly behind the eldest, moved closer to the window, her posture a mix of caution and inquiry. She tilted her head, observing him, her hands resting near her sides as if ready to act if needed. The rancher noticed the subtle hierarchy and coordination among them, a silent communication that dictated who spoke, who observed, and who decided when it was safe to act. He understood that this was a carefully maintained system of survival, honed by necessity, and it demanded respect. For several moments, the three women watched him, their silence heavy with scrutiny. Every movement the rancher made was measured, deliberate, and transparent. He crouched slightly, keeping his eyes level with theirs, showing neither aggression nor fear. The youngest woman spoke next, her voice barely above a whisper. "Have you seen anyone else out here?" she asked. The rancher shook his head. "No. The land is quiet tonight. I haven't encountered anyone since leaving my cabin." His honesty seemed to ease the tension fractionally, though the cautious distance remained. A subtle shift occurred as the rancher offered a small gesture. He reached into his satchel and retrieved a folded piece of cloth, a scrap of dried meat he had carried for the evening. Holding it carefully in his outstretched hand, he said softly, "I thought you might need food. If you don't want it, I understand." The gesture, simple and non-threatening, introduced a tangible element of goodwill. The eldest woman's eyes flickered briefly toward the offering, then back to him, her expression unreadable. After a tense pause, the youngest woman stepped closer to the window, her hand brushing the cloth lightly. She did not take it, but the act alone, the acknowledgement of the gesture, was a small breakthrough. It was a signal that curiosity could coexist with caution, that the presence of the rancher might not automatically equate to danger. The rancher noted the delicate balance, understanding that even this small act carried significance. Trust was not immediate, but the groundwork for interaction had been laid. The air remained taut, yet the rhythm of the encounter shifted subtly. The women's eyes softened fractionally, their postures relaxing just enough to indicate they were willing to observe him without assuming imminent threat. The rancher remained patient, aware that any misstep could undo the fragile progress made. He continued speaking in calm, measured tones, describing his task of gathering firewood, the challenges of the terrain, and the solitude of his life on the ranch. The tension, while still present, had evolved into a cautious engagement. This interaction, built on observation, gestures, and careful dialogue, marked the beginning of understanding. Each participant had tested the other's intent, navigated uncertainty, and begun the delicate dance of trust. It was clear to the rancher that the evening would unfold slowly, with patience as the only path forward. But the first fragile bridge between stranger and stranger had been constructed. The rancher realized that these moments, brief, tense, and measured, were not merely about assessing threat. They were about the human need for connection, the recognition of another's presence, and the negotiation of boundaries in a world that demanded vigilance. In the stillness of the clearing, surrounded by the dimly lit shack and the watchful figures within, the rancher felt the subtle promise of a story unfolding, one that would challenge assumptions, test patience, and reveal the depth of human resilience and cooperation in the face of uncertainty. After several tense minutes, the fragile silence began to shift. The rancher could sense a subtle change in the women's posture, a slight easing of shoulders, and a relaxation of the hands that had remained poised for defense. It was as if his patience and measured approach had sent a message. He was not here to threaten, but to coexist, even if only briefly. The eldest woman's eyes softened ever so slightly, and the youngest gave a small nod toward the fire. It was an unspoken invitation, a tentative acknowledgement that the rancher's presence might be accepted, at least for the moment. Encouraged, the rancher lowered himself to a crouch near the edge of the clearing, keeping enough distance to respect their space. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally. "It's getting colder. That fire inside must be a comfort for you." His words were neutral, offering recognition without presumption. One of the women glanced at the small flame flickering in the hearth, and then back at him, her expression unreadable but attentive. It was a subtle opening, a bridge between isolation and interaction. He reached into his satchel again, this time producing a small wrapped bundle of dried herbs he used to flavor meals back at his ranch. "I carry these with me," he said. "They help make the food taste better. Maybe they could help here too." His voice was calm, measured, and his gesture deliberate, signaling that he offered not only sustenance, but respect for their autonomy. One of the women leaned slightly toward the bundle, inspecting it with a quiet curiosity. The act was small, almost imperceptible, but it represented a crack in the walls of caution they had built around themselves. The eldest woman finally spoke again, her tone softer than before. "Why are you alone out here?" she asked, repeating a question in a slightly gentler way than during their initial tense exchange. The rancher answered truthfully, "I live on a ranch not far from here. I take care of the land, the animals, and myself. I'm used to being alone, but tonight I needed firewood." His words were simple, honest, and devoid of unnecessary embellishment, conveying both experience and vulnerability. The youngest woman tilted her head, as though weighing his answer carefully. She seemed to appreciate the simplicity and honesty of his explanation. There was a pause, a shared silence filled with unspoken assessments and cautious curiosity. The rancher understood the importance of this moment. The women were evaluating not only his intent, but his character, and he was responding with patience and respect rather than haste or assertion. Gradually, the air of suspicion began to soften. The middle woman, who had remained more reserved, took a step closer to the window and gestured toward the fire. "It is warm," she said, her voice low and measured. "You may stay nearby." It was not a full invitation, nor a declaration of trust, but a tentative acceptance of his presence. The rancher nodded slowly, acknowledging their rules without question. He settled himself in a spot that allowed him to remain visible yet non-threatening, maintaining the delicate balance of distance and connection. As the minutes passed, small gestures began to bridge the gap between stranger and stranger. The rancher spoke quietly about the land surrounding the ranch, describing the patterns of wildlife, the changing weather, and the challenges of survival in the wilderness. The women listened intently, their initial caution giving way to curiosity. He observed them in turn, noting the precision and grace in their movements, the subtle coordination among them, and the intelligence reflected in their cautious eyes. It was clear that they had learned to navigate a world that demanded vigilance and resourcefulness, and he respected them for it. The breaking of the ice was subtle, built on shared observation, patience, and the willingness to communicate without force. Words were minimal, but gestures, glances, and the calm presence of the rancher conveyed a message of respect and understanding. Slowly, the tension in the clearing shifted from wary caution to a tentative acknowledgement that coexistence was possible. Trust was not fully established, but the first steps had been taken. The fire inside the shack cast a soft, flickering glow that spilled through the gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating the faces of the three women as they settled into cautious observation of the rancher. By now, the initial tension had eased, replaced by a fragile curiosity that hung in the cool night air. The eldest woman, who had maintained a calm but watchful demeanor, seemed to weigh the decision of how much to reveal. The rancher, sensing this, remained still, keeping his movements slow and respectful, giving them space while signaling a willingness to listen. Finally, the eldest woman spoke again, her voice measured, low, but carrying a hint of trust. "We didn't expect anyone out here," she said, her words deliberate. "We've had to stay hidden." The rancher nodded, understanding the significance behind her statement. The wilderness could be both a refuge and a prison, and the women had learned to navigate the delicate balance between survival and exposure. He replied softly, "I understand. I've spent many nights alone on the ranch myself. I know the land can be unforgiving, and that solitude can teach you to be cautious." His words were honest, offering recognition without probing too deeply, and the eldest woman's eyes softened in acknowledgement. Encouraged by the calm tone, the youngest woman ventured a tentative question. "Why do you come out here alone?" she asked. The rancher paused, considering how to convey his story without seeming boastful or intrusive. "The ranch keeps me busy," he began. "I care for the animals, the land, and the cabin. But sometimes I come into the hills just to walk, to check on the water, or to gather firewood. It's a life of routine, yes, but it teaches patience and observation. You learn to notice the small things, how the wind shifts, how animals behave, even how the light changes through the trees." The middle woman, who had remained more reserved until now, tilted her head, listening closely. There was a subtle curiosity in her expression, a desire to connect the rancher's world with their own. "And you are never afraid?" she asked quietly. The rancher gave a small smile, acknowledging the honesty of her question. "Fear is part of it," he admitted. "You can't ignore it. But experience teaches you caution, how to act deliberately, how to respect the land and its unpredictability. Fear becomes a tool rather than an enemy." A pause followed, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. The eldest woman then began to share a fragment of her own story, her voice low and hesitant. "We have been traveling for weeks, perhaps months," she said. "The world outside has become dangerous for us. We move quietly, we hide, we survive where we can." Her eyes flicked briefly to the other two women, as if seeking permission to continue. "This shack became our refuge for a short while. It is not much, but it is safe. For now." The rancher listened intently, offering occasional nods to encourage her without interrupting. There was a solemn respect in his demeanor, an understanding that their stories were delicate, shared only because trust had begun to form. "I see," he said softly. "Safety is everything out here. I would not want to take that from you. The land can be harsh, but it is also generous if treated with respect." His words reflected both his experience and his empathy, bridging the gap between their lives and his own. The youngest woman then began to describe small details of their journey, the careful selection of places to rest, the scarcity of food, and the constant vigilance required to avoid unwanted attention. She spoke with precision and economy, revealing their resourcefulness and resilience without exposing unnecessary vulnerability. The rancher admired their ingenuity and the quiet strength that each story conveyed. Gradually, the exchange deepened. The rancher began to share more about life on his ranch, about the routines, the animals, and the quiet rhythms that defined his solitary existence. He spoke of early mornings, long rides across the land, and nights spent under the stars, feeling the weight and wonder of the wilderness. The women listened intently, comparing his world with their own, each story a bridge between lives separated by circumstance, but united by the shared experience of survival. By the time the night had fully descended, a mutual understanding had begun to form. They were no longer strangers, simply observing each other. They were participants in a delicate exchange of trust, stories, and recognition. Through these shared narratives, walls of fear and caution had started to crumble, replaced by an awareness of human connection and the resilience of those who navigate the wilderness with care, intelligence, and respect. The rancher realized that the night's journey, which had begun as a simple quest for firewood, had transformed into something far deeper. The stories exchanged in that dimly lit shack created a bond, fragile yet significant, illustrating that even in the harshest and most isolated landscapes, empathy and understanding could find a place to grow. The night had settled fully over. The rugged landscape and the soft glow of the fire from the shack flickered against the wooden walls, illuminating the three women as they prepared for the night. The rancher had spent hours listening to their stories, sharing fragments of his own life, and quietly earning a degree of trust he had not expected when he first set out in search of firewood. Now, with the darkness deepening and the wind carrying a crisp chill, the time had come for him to return to his cabin, but he could not leave without addressing the precarious situation of his newfound acquaintances. He rose slowly, mindful of his movements, and spoke softly. "I should head back before it gets too late. The night can be cold and treacherous." His words carried both concern and respect, signaling that he was leaving of his own accord while remaining aware of the fragility of their connection. The eldest woman regarded him carefully, her eyes reflecting the firelight, and after a moment's pause, she nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that his presence had been accepted and that his departure would not breach their fragile trust. Before leaving, he offered a small bundle of supplies he had brought along, a few dried food items, a flask of water, and some cloth he thought might be useful for warmth. "Take these," he said gently, holding the items toward them. "They're not much, but they might help for tonight. You don't need to accept them if you don't want to." The women exchanged a brief glance, their expressions a mixture of surprise and appreciation. After a moment, the eldest woman extended her hand to accept the bundle, a subtle sign of trust and acknowledgement. The rancher stepped back, keeping a respectful distance, and began the trek back through the grove. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground, and the faint rustle of nocturnal creatures accompanied his careful steps. He paused occasionally, glancing back toward the shack, where the women remained silhouetted against the glow of the fire. There was a quiet dignity in their posture, a resilience that had been evident from the moment he first approached. The encounter had left an impression, one that would linger far beyond the physical distance separating them. As he walked, the rancher reflected on the events of the evening. What had begun as a mundane task, gathering firewood for warmth, had transformed into an experience of connection, patience, and understanding. He realized that the wilderness, while often unforgiving and isolating, also created opportunities for human empathy to flourish. The encounter with the women had reminded him that even in isolation, the human spirit could recognize and respond to sincerity, courage, and respect. Reaching the edge of his familiar path, he felt the weight of solitude anew, but it was different now. The evening had expanded his understanding of the land and of the unexpected ways it could bring people together. He thought about the women, their quiet strength, and the careful measures they had taken to survive and protect one another. He understood that their world, though hidden and separate from his own, was guided by similar principles of vigilance, resourcefulness, and respect for the land. Back at his cabin, the rancher stacked the firewood he had collected during the journey, the physical labor grounding him after the emotional and mental intensity of the encounter. As the stove crackled to life, he allowed himself to reflect more deeply on the lessons of the night. He realized that the boundaries between isolation and connection were often fragile, and that moments of trust, however brief, could leave a lasting impact. The women had shared their stories not out of obligation, but because they saw in him a measure of understanding and respect, a recognition of shared humanity.